Hello and welcome back to Relentless Learning. So I'm going to get into the material right away, but first I need you to think about a time that you had an argument, a discussion, a little heated discussion, family member, a partner, parent, friend, person on the street. Now, it is possible that you had a difference of opinion and that kind of factored into the discussion that you had, but how many of those times did you realize later, an hour later, the next day, next week, that you were actually just talking about different things? So in this video, we're going to be covering some of the vocabulary that's really, sometimes it's portrayed in particular ways that may be accurate, or there might be some misconceptions thrown in there. So let's get to it. Hopefully it'll be clear as mud by the end of the video. So the first one is multiculturalism. Sounds great, right? Now, it kind of became introduced in Canada with Papa Trudeau, so Justin Trudeau's father, and you can think of it as being like a hyphenated Canadian. So American Canadian, Chinese Canadian. You could have pride and you could represent yourself as someone who had a different ethnicity, right? While also taking part in being Canadian. Now, this was great because it introduced you to different cultures, it introduced you to different foods, and kind of had that exposure. Now, the trouble with multiculturalism is it doesn't necessarily look at who's in power. So that's kind of where we move on to that next point in the spectrum, and that is diversity. Diversity says we need to have diverse, different bodies in an institution, which sounds great, right? You're having mixed skin colors, different people of different religions, different bodies in an institution. Now, the trouble or the challenge with this is it doesn't ask where are these bodies situated. So let's say you walk into a bank and you see diverse bodies on that first floor in terms of tellers. But as you take the elevator and you start going up into those higher positions of power, CEO, VP, you're not seeing that same diversity. So that's where we move on to the third piece, which is inclusion. Now, inclusion is great because it not only says we need diverse bodies in institutions, but also looks at where they are relative to that organization. So we need to have diverse bodies at the decision-making table. Sounds great. Now, when you think of inclusion, it kind of falls short, or two things to consider rather. Not necessarily that it falls short, but we need to consider two things. The first one is that inclusion doesn't necessarily challenge any of the existing ways of doing things, existing ways of even thinking. So it doesn't necessarily look at biases that people at that decision-making table might have, and it doesn't necessarily look at how we at that decision-making table might have a filtered lens. So it doesn't bring in that personal reflection. The second piece is that it doesn't disrupt or necessarily challenge the norms. So it doesn't basically, let's think of a democracy, right? You technically have one person, one vote. Let's say we're talking about an issue that pertains to Indigenous people in Canada. Now, if we have 10 people on this decision-making council, this team, and 2 of them are Indigenous, 8 of them are not Indigenous, you do kind of have to ask, well, the experience of the non-Indigenous might be different than the experience of the 2 Indigenous people on the team. So this one person, one vote idea or way of doing things potentially becomes problematic when certain situations involve certain groups, but they're not part of the decision-making table in a way that statistically represents them. Right? It's that idea of if you're making a decision about me, I should also be a part of this table. So this is where we get into the antis. So the anti-racism, anti-Black racism, anti-colonialism, anti-oppressive teaching. Now, the antis are different than inclusion because they actually ask, how is power operating? Whose perspectives are being included? Whose are being excluded? And how does that affect the decision-making process? Now, it becomes very complicated, right? Because if you're having a decision, let's say, for example, what's going on in the States with making decisions, legally enforced decisions about women's bodies, or the majority of women being involved, right? We're going to talk about what that looks like in certain contexts in education, as well as just in the Canadian context. And you're going to see that it's a little bit more complex than just saying, I agree or I disagree. There's lots of different levels to it. But hopefully these definitions have given you some idea of what's being said, or hopefully what's being meant when it's being said. And yeah, we'll see you in the next video. Bye.